A girl stayed over at her friend's house, but none of them could have imagined the horror that awaited them. In the middle of the night, an unknown criminal broke in and attacked them, then fled. This was just the beginning. What followed shocked even FBI agents and became one of the most high-profile cases in the country. Crystal Searles was born in 1989 in Kansas. She had loving parents and 2 younger sisters. The girls often fought and argued. Crystal frequently had to look after them while their parents were at work, which her sisters disliked because it felt like she was bossing them around. However, in times of trouble, they were all ready to help each other. In 1999, when Crystal was 10, her parents decided to move to a small town called Del Rio in the neighboring state. During one of their visits to scout for a home, they met the Harris family, who lived almost opposite the house they had chosen. Crystal quickly became friends with 13-year-old Katy Harris and eagerly awaited the move to spend more time with her friend. The move was planned for the end of the year, with her parents gradually transferring their belongings. The final move was scheduled immediately after New Year's. With their Kansas home nearly empty, Crystal's parents decided to let her stay over at Katy's from December 31st to January 1st. Crystal was thrilled about this decision. She would get to ring in the new year with her friend, and she couldn't wait. Her parents also decided to send one of her younger sisters, 7-year-old Marky, with her. Ultimately, Crystal and her sister spent New Year's Eve with Katy, her mother, and 3 other Harris children. Crystal and Katy had a great time. They watched a movie, ate popcorn, and were preparing to go to bed later in the night. Marky wanted to sleep in the same room on the floor, but Crystal told her to sleep in a separate room. Marky was very upset and couldn't sleep for several hours, angry at her older sister. In the middle of the night, Crystal suddenly woke up to a scream. At first, she didn't understand what was happening. The girls were sleeping in a bunk bed, Crystal on the top and Katy on the bottom. For some reason, the bedroom light was on. She looked down and, to her horror, saw a man standing next to the lower bunk. Terrified, she froze, not making a sound. She saw the man cover Katy's mouth with his hand and stab her in the neck. Crystal didn't know what to do. She wanted to help her friend, but feared that the man would kill her if he noticed her. The attacker turned toward the door, but as he reached the doorway, he glanced around the room and saw Crystal. He approached her bed, grabbed her, and pulled her towards him. Crystal tried to resist, but she couldn't do anything against a grown man. The attacker pulled out the knife again and slashed Crystal's throat. Then he turned off the light, left the room, and closed the door. Crystal lay there with a wound on her neck, bleeding, but found the strength to crawl towards Katy. Katy was making gurgling sounds, and Crystal tried to comfort her. She wanted to tell her everything would be okay, but found she couldn't make a sound. Soon, Katy stopped showing signs of life. Crystal lay on the floor, not knowing what to do. After about a minute, she heard the sound of a car door slamming and a vehicle driving off. Thinking the attacker had left, she told herself she needed to get up and call for help for Katy. First, Crystal went to her younger sister's room, but she couldn't wake her up because she couldn't speak. Crystal then thought that since the house was so quiet and nobody had come to help, the attacker must have killed everyone else in the Harris family. With a severe neck wound and dressed only in her pajamas, Crystal ran outside, hoping to find some help. Even though this happened in Texas, the nights at the end of December were quite cold. But Crystal knew she had to help her friend. Once outside, she saw a light in the distance. The Harris's home was on the outskirts, and the nearest neighbor was about a kilometer away. Despite the distance, Crystal knew she had no other choice and walked toward the light. When she reached the house, she began to knock on the door. The homeowner asked who it was, but she couldn't answer. Eventually, he opened the door and saw the little girl with blood streaming from her neck. He immediately called 911. While waiting for the ambulance, Crystal gestured for a pen and paper. She wrote that the Harris family had been attacked and asked him to hurry the ambulance. She also wrote, "Will I live?" The man assured her she would be okay. But he didn't believe it. Given the amount of blood, he expected the girl to die any minute. Finally, the ambulance arrived at his house and took Crystal to the hospital. She was in critical condition, and the doctors weren't sure if she would survive the blood loss. Meanwhile, the police arrived at the Harris home. They found Katy's body in her bedroom, but everyone else was alive. Her mother and the other children woke up only after the officers arrived, as did Marky. She opened her eyes and saw a woman in her room telling her to get up and follow her. When she walked into the hallway, she saw a lot of blood on the floor and realized something terrible had happened. Medical experts quickly determined that Katy had no chance of survival. Besides the neck wound, she had 16 other stab wounds. Meanwhile, doctors were fighting for Crystal's life. They needed to transport her by helicopter to another hospital, but they required her parents' permission. Early in the morning, they called her mother. Shocked, the woman gave her consent and immediately drove to the hospital in San Antonio. Upon arrival, they performed surgery on Crystal and put her on a ventilator. She woke up several hours later, and by that time, her mother was already with her. When Crystal regained consciousness, she found that she could speak again and immediately asked her mother if Katy was okay. Her mother didn't want to tell her the truth, fearing the news of her friend's death would negatively impact Crystal. However, she eventually had to tell her. Upon learning that her friend was dead, Crystal wanted the police to catch the culprit as soon as possible. The investigators, who had been waiting for Crystal to be able to talk about the incident, invited a police sketch artist who created a portrait of the suspect based on Crystal's description. She described the man as having long, dark hair and a beard covering most of his face, along with dark, angry eyes. Seeing the artist's work, Crystal said the drawing closely resembled the killer. The police began reviewing the records of previously convicted criminals in the area and collected several photos from their database. They returned to the hospital with these photos, and Crystal carefully examined each one. Then she stopped at one photo and silently pointed to it. It was the same man she had seen that night. The man was 35-year-old Tommy Lynn Searles. He had a significant criminal history and lived in Del Rio. Detectives immediately went to his home. They approached his trailer and called for Tommy, but there was no answer. However, the door was ajar, so the police entered. They found the man in his room, and he calmly said, "I'm glad I finally got caught. I'm tired of doing this." When they handcuffed him, he didn't even ask why he was being arrested. During the first interrogation, Tommy confessed to everything. He explained that he had decided to break into the house that night and found an open window. He entered, walked through all the rooms, and listed everyone he saw sleeping. But he chose Katy as his victim. Apparently, he knew their family and had long targeted this girl. He approached her, cut her underwear with a knife, and attempted to assault her. But she resisted and screamed. However, the man quickly grabbed her, covered her mouth with his hand, and killed her. Her scream, it seemed, wasn't loud enough to wake anyone except Crystal, so nobody else woke up. Tommy was about to leave but saw Crystal at the last moment and decided to eliminate her. He slashed her throat, left the house, and drove away, assuming the second girl was also dead. He even agreed to go with the police to the Harris home to show how he committed the crime. He recounted everything with a smile, and the detectives got the impression that Tommy was genuinely proud of his actions. However, the police knew this wasn't his first crime. While he had mainly been arrested for minor offenses like theft, fighting, and drunk driving, he had previously assaulted a woman and served 4 years in prison. Despite all this, investigators began to suspect Tommy might be linked to other serious crimes. The way he calmly broke into a stranger's house, committed murder, and left without waking anyone except Crystal led the police to believe he might have done something similar before. Before they could start investigating his other potential crimes, Tommy surprised the detectives. On the way back from the Harris home, while sitting in the police car, he said, "You probably want to know about the others too." The ordeal of Tommy Searles. After a few words, the police began questioning Tommy, unaware that these conversations would stretch over several months. Initially, Tommy recounted his troubled childhood. He grew up in a large family without a father, and his mother struggled to raise all the children. Before he turned 2, both Tommy and his twin sister were diagnosed with a serious illness. His sister died, but Tommy survived. From a young age, Tommy led a problematic lifestyle. He started drinking at 7, rarely attended school, and engaged in petty thefts. At 8, a neighbor abused him, an incident that continued for some time. His behavior became increasingly aggressive and erratic. At 10, Tommy took off his clothes and climbed into his mother's bed, attempting to assault her. This was the final straw for his family, who left him behind. From then on, Tommy lived a life of crime, surviving through theft. He confessed to committing his first murder in 1979 at the age of 15. He broke into a stranger's house and shot him. This case remained unsolved, and police records mentioned a person resembling Tommy seen near the crime scene. Tommy traveled across the country, living in different states. Over several months of talks with detectives, he admitted to more than 70 murders. The police checked each of his stories, but quickly realized that Tommy might be exaggerating his crimes. The challenge was that in many cases, investigators could not link him to the murders, or they found evidence contradicting his statements. Ultimately, the police concluded that Tommy was taking credit for other people's crimes, likely enjoying the attention his confessions brought. All interviews were conducted in the presence of a journalist who reported Tommy's stories in the media. Tommy described his crimes with apparent enjoyment and pride. Detectives decided he was eager to take responsibility for any murder to attract more attention. However, the police managed to confirm his involvement in 22 murders. Beyond his confessions, they had no physical evidence to charge him. They believed he was responsible for more murders, but couldn't confirm his involvement, even theoretically. At one point, they began to think Tommy himself might not remember all the murders he committed. In addition to drinking heavily, Tommy used strong, illegal drugs, which might have caused memory lapses or confusion about certain facts. In 1999, besides the murder of Katy Harris and the attack on Crystal, Tommy confessed to killing 4 more people, 3 of whom were children. Due to the lack of substantial evidence of his guilt, the police could only take Tommy to court for the murders of Katy and the attack on Crystal. The trial began in mid-2000, 6 months after his arrest. The prosecutor announced his intention to seek the death penalty. By then, Crystal had almost fully recovered and eagerly awaited the chance to testify against her friend's killer. When the time came, Tommy asked to leave the courtroom, but Crystal insisted he stay for her testimony. She detailed the attack, looking him in the eye. Tommy barely looked at her, frequently averting his gaze. Tommy's defense failed to provide convincing arguments against the death penalty, and he received that sentence. He was transferred to prison to await execution, a process that stretched over many years. During this time, Tommy confessed to another murder, and the police tried to link him to yet another crime. They hoped to have him convicted, but the case never went to court. He also gave a TV interview where he discussed his murders and motivations. Tommy claimed he imagined killing the neighbor who abused him whenever he killed his victims. He added that he never felt remorse and believed he was freeing his victims' souls by committing these atrocities. When asked if he remembered the girl who survived his attack, Tommy said he thought about Crystal every day but refused to apologize or convey any other message to her. Tommy spent 14 years in prison before his execution in 2014. Relatives of Katy and other victims he confessed to killing attended the execution. Crystal also witnessed it, watching as Tommy received the lethal injection. Before his death, he declined to make a final statement, merely smiling at a few friends who came to see him. Crystal struggled to return to normal life for many years. She had trouble sleeping and spent hours each night planning escape routes and actions in case the killer entered her room. Her relationship with her sisters improved significantly after the incident. They stopped being hurt and angry at her for being bossy, understanding that Crystal's actions were out of care for them. Tommy's story didn't end with his execution. In 2015, a woman contacted the police after watching a documentary about his crimes. Her mother was murdered in 1982, and she and her sister were injured. The girl identified the killer as Rodney Lincoln, leading to his imprisonment. After watching the documentary, the witness realized she had accused the wrong person, and Tommy Searles was the real killer. The case was reviewed, confirming Rodney's innocence. He was released from prison after 36 years at the age of 77. In 2016, Crystal and her sisters were harassed online by a man who sent them gruesome crime scene photos and taunting messages. He blamed Crystal for Katy's death, saying she didn't seek help quickly enough and threatened to kill her, sending her address. Crystal contacted the police, who quickly identified the harasser as 25-year-old Alvin Willie from Florida, who claimed he was doing it for fun. The judge didn't appreciate his humor and sentenced him to 4 years in prison. Crystal has since given several interviews expressing her gratitude for being alive. She fully recovered from the attack and stopped thinking about Tommy. The actual number of his victims is likely much higher than the confirmed 22, but detectives doubt they will ever prove his involvement in more cases. They find solace in knowing Tommy is no longer alive and can't harm anyone else. The reason Tommy evaded police detection for so long was simple. He had no job or home and never stayed in one place. Constantly traveling between cities and states using hitchhiking, he gained experience with each murder, leaving no evidence behind. Over time, he earned the nickname Coast to Coast Killer, as his victims were scattered across the country. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments, and don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.